Hello everyone. Thank you for being here with me today. Go ahead and get comfortable. Pour yourself a hot cup of coffee or maybe some tea. I have a feeling this is going to be a very long conversation. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and you just know something is completely wrong? It is not something you can see or touch right away. It is just in the air. A static charge that makes the little hairs on your arms stand straight up. Like the dead quiet before a tornado rips right through your town. Or that sixth sense your grandmother always swore by. That is exactly what hit me, like a physical and heavy force, the very second my heels clicked against the marble floor of the Grand Meridian Ballroom. Before I even left the apartment that evening, something felt deeply off. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my walk-in closet. It was a massive space that my husband Monty had insisted on building, filled with designer clothes I rarely ever wore. I am a practical woman. I prefer comfort over flash. But for tonight, I had chosen a simple, elegant navy blue suit. Powerful but understated. That was me. I was the foundation. I was the steel beams hidden right behind the pretty facade. I put on the diamond earrings Monty had given me for our 5th anniversary. I remember that night clearly. He had made a huge show of it at a fancy restaurant, holding my hands and telling me I was the absolute bedrock of his success. I touched one of the cold diamonds, a strange sense of dark irony washing over me. Bedrock can be shattered after all. I looked down at my hands. I was clutching a small, elegantly wrapped gift box. Inside was a vintage 1962 Vacheron Constantin watch. A classic, understated, brilliant masterpiece of engineering. It was everything I admired in the world. Monty had mentioned it in passing many months ago. He pointed it out in some glossy luxury magazine while we were waiting for a flight. He forgot about it the very next day. I did not forget. That is what devoted wives do. We listen. We remember the little things. We move heaven and earth to make them happen. The price tag on that watch was astronomical. Let us just say it could have funded a promising startup for a whole year, or paid for a very generous college fund. It was a drop in the bucket for our company, but a deeply significant symbol for me. A testament to a partnership I still foolishly believed in. The drive over to the venue was unnervingly quiet. The city lights of New York blurred past the window of the Uber. It looked like a river of golden white light against the dark, rainy glass. I should have been excited. This was the annual gala for Luminatech Solutions. It was the tech company I had built from absolutely nothing. But sitting in the back of that car, watching the raindrops race down the window pane, my chest felt incredibly tight. My intuition was screaming at me to tell the driver to turn around and take me back home. I ignored it. I smoothed down my skirt, took a deep breath, and told myself I was just being overly anxious. To understand why that night was so devastating, you have to understand where it all started. To the rest of the world, Luminatech Solutions was Monty's company. He was the handsome, charismatic frontman with the perfect smile and the tailored suits. I was the reclusive genius. I was the coder who preferred the clean, honest logic of algorithms to the messy, fake politics of the corporate boardroom. It was a role I had accepted. I even embraced it for years. I did it for him. I did it for us. When my grandmother passed away, it broke my heart. Her funeral was a rainy, miserable day, but she left me with something incredibly important. She left me a small inheritance. Exactly $250,000. The note in her will was very specific. She wrote that this money was for my dreams, not for anyone else to waste. She told me to build something that would last. Bless her wise and practical heart. I took that money and I locked myself in a cramped, dusty apartment with second-hand furniture. I fueled my days with lukewarm coffee and relentless ambition. I wrote every single line of the core code for Luminatech. I spent thousands of hours staring at a computer screen until my eyes burned. I built the architecture. I designed the security protocols. I filed the patents under my own name. When the company finally launched and started making real money, Monty stepped right into the spotlight. He was good at talking to investors. He was good at shaking hands. I gave him a generous salary and the title he desperately wanted. I let him play the king while I quietly ran the kingdom from the shadows. But over the last year, things had changed. He started making decisions without consulting me. He hired new people I did not approve of. The worst part was the sudden promotion of Roxanne. Roxy is my stepsister. She slithered into my life when I was 16 years old, right after my father remarried her mother. Roxy was all sharp angles and a predatory smile. She had a terrifying talent for finding your biggest insecurity and pressing hard on it until you completely broke. From day one, she made it her singular mission to take everything that was mine. My father's attention. My friends. My small teenage triumphs. And now, Monty had somehow manipulated the board into making her the new chief executive officer, pushing him up to chairman. He told me it was a strategic move. He said she had the aggressive corporate connections we needed. I hated it, but I trusted my husband. I did not want to think about a divorce. I wanted my family to work. I was so incredibly blind. When I finally arrived at the Grand Meridian Ballroom, the place was practically dripping with money. It was almost vulgar. Crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small car, hung from the ceiling like frozen fireworks. They scattered prismatic light everywhere across the room. The marble floors were so polished you could see the tired lines around your own eyes in their reflection. This was the obscene luxury Monty absolutely loved. The kind of luxury that screams to the world that we have more money than sense. All of it was paid for by the silent, tireless work of the code I had written in that dusty little room years ago. As I moved through the massive crowd, that strange, awful feeling in my gut intensified rapidly. The air was thick with unspoken words. Conversations would stutter and die the moment I approached a group. I would walk past, and the talking would flare up again in hushed, excited whispers right behind my back. I saw people I had known for 7 years. I saw board members' wives I had shared lunches and dinners with. They would look at me, give me a quick, tight, incredibly awkward smile, and then their eyes would rapidly dart away. I looked at their faces. I studied their expressions, trying to understand what was happening. Their faces were filled with something I could not quite place at first. Then it hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. It was pity. Pity is a terrible, corrosive thing to see on the faces of your peers. It makes you feel incredibly small. It makes you feel entirely exposed, like you are standing naked in a crowded room. I clutched the small box containing the Vacheron Constantin watch tighter in my hands. The box suddenly felt ridiculously small and insignificant in the vastness of that hostile room. I walked past a massive ice sculpture of the Luminatech logo. It was a perfect, gleaming testament to my life's hard work, and it was already starting to melt under the heat of 1,000 tiny betrayals. There were waiters walking around with ridiculous swan-shaped pastries and expensive champagne. Everything looked perfect, but everything felt completely wrong. Then the laughter started. It was not the polite, tinkling sound of champagne-fueled amusement that you usually hear at these corporate events. No, this was a raw, ugly, guttural sound. The kind of laughter that comes deep from the belly. The kind of laughter that feeds greedily on someone else's severe pain. It was the sound a ruthless mob makes. It was the sound of my entire life imploding. And everyone in that massive room had a front row seat to the show. My heart began to hammer violently against my ribs. It felt like a frantic bird trapped inside a cage. I followed the sound of the cruel laughter. I was drawn toward it like a foolish moth to a destructive flame. The noise led me to a small elevated stage at the front of the ballroom. It was set up for the evening speeches. I pushed past a group of junior developers. And that is when I saw him. I saw my husband of 7 years. Monty was up there looking every bit the dashing, successful corporate leader. He was the man of the hour. He was down on one knee. My very first thought, a fleeting and nonsensical flash of pure denial, was that he was just tying his expensive Italian leather shoe. Or perhaps he had dropped a gold cufflink on the stage. But he was not looking down at the floor. He was holding a microphone in one hand and a small black velvet box in the other. The box was wide open. It revealed a diamond ring so comically large it looked like a jagged shard of ice. And he was looking up with an expression of pure adoration. It was an expression I had not seen on his face when he looked at me in many years. He was looking directly at the company's brand new chief executive officer. It was Roxy. She stood there in a skin-tight scarlet dress that left absolutely nothing to the imagination. She looked down at him. A woman I knew all too well. A woman who had haunted the edges of my life for over 2 decades. She always acted like she had custody over my happiness, deciding when to take it away. It seemed she was finally making her grandest, most devastating play of all. I stopped breathing. The entire room seemed to spin around me. My feet felt glued to the marble floor. Monty's voice echoed through the ballroom. It was amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system I had personally approved the budget for just last month. Every single word he spoke was a perfectly crafted dagger. These were daggers honed over months of secret meetings and whispered promises, aimed right at my chest. "Roxanne," he said into the microphone. His voice was thick with a fake, theatrical emotion that made my skin crawl and my stomach turn. "Will you marry me?" He paused. He was a master showman milking the dramatic moment. He let the massive crowd hang on his next words. He turned his head slightly, just enough to look out into the audience. He scanned the faces until his eyes locked directly onto mine. I saw the cruel, deliberate smirk playing on his lips. He knew exactly what he was doing. "I am ready to leave my poor, frigid wife for you right now," he announced clearly into the microphone. The room completely erupted. The laughter was a concussive physical blow. It knocked the air straight from my lungs and sent a roaring, rushing sound through my ears. It was a massive tidal wave of public humiliation. I was drowning in it. I was suffocating under the heavy weight of hundreds of mocking, staring eyes. I could see the smartphones everywhere. It was a sea of screens held up high in the air. Their small red recording lights were blinking like malevolent fireflies in the dark. They were capturing my public execution for eternity. I looked back up at the stage. My stepsister Roxy looked down at my husband. Her smile was the most terrible, wicked thing I had ever seen in my life. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated triumph. It was the exact same smile I had seen when she convinced my father I was the one who had broken our mother's favorite antique vase when we were kids. She leaned intimately into the microphone he held up for her. Her voice was as smooth and sweet as toxic poison. "Yes," she said. Her voice rang out as clear as a bell over the speakers. "Yes, I will." The roar that followed her answer was totally deafening. There were loud cheers, sharp whistles, and thunderous applause. The people in that room were on their feet. They were celebrating as if they had just witnessed a beautiful royal wedding, instead of the systematic, brutal destruction of my marriage and my life. Monty slid the massive ring onto her finger. He stood up and pulled her into a deep, dramatic, disgusting kiss worthy of a cheap Hollywood movie. Someone standing very near me actually hooted with joy. I just stood there completely frozen. I was still holding that stupid, expensive vintage watch in its stupid, perfect silver wrapping. I was forced to watch my husband kiss my stepsister while hundreds of people celebrated. These were people who had eaten food at my dining table. These were people who had smiled nicely to my face and cashed the paychecks I signed. The watch in my hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. It was a dead weight. It was a pathetic symbol of a love that had never truly been real. The smart play, the one everyone in that entire room was eagerly hoping for, was for me to completely lose my mind. They wanted me to scream at the top of my lungs. They wanted me to run up those stage stairs and claw at Roxy's perfectly smug face. They wanted me to throw the expensive gift box at Monty's head. They desperately wanted me to cause a scene so epic it would be gossiped about over brunch for the next 5 years. They wanted the free entertainment they felt they were rightfully owed. Nothing entertains the wealthy quite like watching someone else lose their carefully constructed dignity in a very public way. But here is the thing you learn after spending 15 years staring into the cold, binary heart of a computer. When you build complex systems from nothing but raw logic and sheer willpower, you learn something vital. You learn to detach. You learn that raw emotion is a dangerous liability in a crisis. You learn to play the long game. You learn that the absolute best revenge is not a hot, messy, emotional outburst. It is a cold, methodical, systematic dismantling of your enemy's life. It is a beautifully written algorithm of pure destruction. So, instead of giving them the hysterical meltdown they desperately craved, instead of giving them the dramatic confrontation they were all secretly recording on their phones, I did something that confused the hell out of every single person in that ballroom. I simply turned around. There was no shouting. There were no tears streaming down my face. There were no dramatic declarations of war. I just pivoted smoothly on my heel. I kept my back completely straight. I kept my chin held high. I walked away as if I were leaving a particularly boring board meeting that had simply run on for too long. The silver gift box stayed firmly clutched in my hands. I was absolutely damned if I was going to leave a small fortune's worth of Swiss craftsmanship and my own good taste behind for these absolute vultures. The energy in the massive room shifted abruptly as I moved toward the exit. It was palpable. A distinct ripple of deep confusion spread through the crowd like a wave hitting the shore. This was not in their script. Where was the rage? Where were the hysterics? Where was the public breakdown? I kept walking. My steps were steady and measured on the cold marble floor. I passed the towering champagne fountain. I gave the new doorman a slight, courteous nod as he opened the massive brass doors for me. His face was a total mask of professional confusion. I did not look back. I stepped out into the cool, damp Manhattan night. The honest, chaotic symphony of the city greeted me. The blaring yellow taxi horns, the distant wailing sirens, the low murmur of a million real lives going on around me. It felt infinitely more real and comforting than the manufactured, toxic drama I had just escaped inside that hotel. My Uber was already there waiting. It was a black sedan idling quietly at the wet curb. I had called at the very moment I heard Monty's voice echo on that microphone. The moment I understood exactly what was happening. I may be a lot of things. I may be a fool, a woman publicly scorned, a betrayed wife. But stupid is not one of them. I slid into the back seat of the car. The leather felt very cool against my hot skin. The driver was a man in his late 50s with kind, tired eyes. He glanced at me in the rearview mirror as he pulled away from the curb. He took in my formal, soaking wet navy suit. He looked at the silver gift box I was still clutching against my chest like a life raft. "Rough night?" he asked gently. It is a very funny thing, the kindness of total strangers. Sometimes it is the absolute only kindness you get in a day. I looked out the rain-streaked window at the glittering, ostentatious facade of the Grand Meridian Hotel. The party inside was already kicking back into high gear. I could clearly see the dark silhouettes of the happy revelers dancing behind the thick glass. I thought about Monty and Roxy up there. I pictured them happily toasting their brand new life together with the expensive champagne I had paid for. "No," I said quietly. A strange, completely cold smile touched my own lips for the first time that night. I meant it with every single fiber of my being. It is getting better by the minute. They truly thought they had won the war. They thought they had successfully taken everything from me. My dignity, my husband, my company. The poor, stupid fools had absolutely no idea what was rapidly coming for them. The real party was just getting started, and I was the only one holding the invitations. I leaned my head back against the seat and began to mentally outline the precise sequence of commands I needed to execute the moment I got to a keyboard. My luxury penthouse felt completely different when I finally walked through the front door. Physically, of course, everything was exactly the same. The ridiculously expensive, incredibly uncomfortable white Italian sofa Monty had insisted on buying. The pretentious, ugly abstract art pieces on the walls that cost more than a public school teacher's annual salary. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing a billion-dollar panoramic view of a city that had just witnessed my utter humiliation. But the energy in the space had completely shifted. The very air in the rooms felt lighter. It was as if a heavy pressure valve that had been slowly tightening around my neck for 7 long years had finally been released. The suffocating pretense of my marriage was permanently gone. I walked straight into the pristine, unused kitchen. I tossed the silver gift box onto the gleaming marble island. It landed with a very satisfying, definitive thud right next to a decorative crystal bowl of organic figs. I had to stop thinking of this place as our life. My life had slowly become a performance piece. It was an aesthetically pleasing tableau of corporate success that was utterly hollow on the inside. I walked away from the kitchen and went straight to the built-in wet bar in the living room. I bypassed the imported champagne. I ignored the expensive vodkas and the botanical gins. I reached directly for the bottle of Macallan 25-year-old Scotch. The really good stuff. This was the bottle Monty always patronizingly referred to as Connie's little hobby. He always acted as if my deep appreciation for a finely crafted single malt was some quaint, silly little quirk, like knitting or collecting old stamps. Tonight, it was not a hobby. Tonight, it was strong medicine. It was premium fuel for the fire burning in my chest. I poured 3 thick fingers of the amber liquid into a heavy crystal tumbler. No ice. No water. I took a slow sip. The sharp burn of the whiskey as it went down my throat was clean and harsh. It felt brutally honest in a way nothing else in my daily life had felt for months, maybe even years. I had been lying to myself for so incredibly long about what my marriage had actually become. I had compromised so much of myself that I had forgotten what the unvarnished truth even tasted like. Turns out, the truth tastes exactly like expensive scotch and the solid promise of righteous, ice-cold fury. I carried my glass down the long hallway. My private home office was situated at the very far end of the penthouse. It was my only true sanctuary in this massive apartment. Monty absolutely hated this room. He always complained that it had zero style. It was filled with heavy, dark wood furniture. It had comfortable, worn leather chairs that were actually meant to be sat in for long hours. The tall shelves were lined with real, actual books. Books on advanced quantum computing, complex algorithmic theory, and thick historical biographies. They were not just decorative matching spines chosen by an overpriced interior designer. Most importantly, this room held my secrets. Hidden behind a large, moody oil painting of the Brooklyn Bridge was a biometric steel wall safe. I pressed my thumb firmly against the glowing scanner. The heavy steel door recognized me and swung open with a soft, satisfying hiss. I reached deep inside the dark safe and pulled out a thick, heavy black leather folder. It felt cool and incredibly solid in my shaking hands. The label on the front was printed from a cheap label maker in my own neat, blocky handwriting. It read, "Primary Assets." Monty had laughed at me relentlessly for keeping physical paper copies of everything important. "Who needs paper anymore, Connie?" he had scoffed just last month. "Everything is secure on the cloud. You are living in the Stone Age." He was so arrogant. He said this to the very woman who had personally designed and built the damn cloud architecture his company relied on. The woman who knew every single one of its hidden vulnerabilities and backdoors. That is who needs paper. The woman who fully understood that in a highly contentious corporate divorce, ruthless lawyers and skeptical judges always prefer a tangible, undeniable paper trail. The woman who had quietly watched her husband's so-called business lunches with her own manipulative stepsister become far more frequent and last far longer than any legitimate business required. I paid Harrison, my brilliant corporate lawyer, a small fortune years ago to ensure these documents were bulletproof. I carried the heavy folder to my wide mahogany desk. I cleared away some loose pens and a notepad. I spread the contents out across the smooth wooden expanse. Each document lying there was a solid brick in the foundation of the massive empire I had built with my own 2 hands. There were the original, yellowing incorporation papers for Luminatech Solutions, filed exactly 7 years ago. My signature was bold, clear, and steady at the bottom. Monty's signature was right next to it, looking a little too flamboyant and rushed. The numbers on that paper were irrefutable. He legally owned 10% of the entire company. I legally owned 90%. I had given him that 10% on our wedding day as a generous gift. It was supposed to be a loving gesture of our new partnership. Looking at it now under the warm glow of my desk lamp, that gesture seemed profoundly, embarrassingly naive. Next to the incorporation papers lay the real treasure. There were 23 separate, highly technical patent applications. Each one of those thick stacks of paper represented thousands of agonizing hours of my life. They represented millions of lines of flawless code, and countless lonely moments of deep frustration and sudden, brilliant breakthrough. All of them were legally filed with my full name, Constance Evans, listed as the sole primary inventor. These specific patents were the absolute engine of the entire company. They were the highly guarded secret sauce that generated over 99% of Luminatech's massive annual revenue. These pieces of paper had funded our lavish lifestyle. They paid for this ridiculous penthouse. They paid for Monty's custom-tailored Italian suits. And, I now realized with a sickening, heavy clarity in my gut, they had directly funded Roxy's recent, unearned promotion to Chief Executive Officer. Finally, I pulled out the old bank statements from the very beginning. The initial seed money for Luminatech. It was a faded copy of a wire transfer for exactly $250,000. It had come directly from my personal savings account, representing the very last dime of my dear grandmother's inheritance. I took another long sip of the Macallan. The burning sensation grounded me in the present moment. I pulled my sleek silver laptop from my leather work bag and opened it. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for just a second. Then, they began flying across the keys with practiced, furious precision. I bypassed the standard employee portals and opened the company's core financial management system. I had designed this specific interface myself, entirely from the ground up, years before we ever hired a proper accounting team. It was my impenetrable digital fortress. It was built with hidden back doors and emergency kill switches that absolutely no one else on the payroll knew existed. Monty had never even bothered to learn how to log into this system. "It is way too complicated, honey," he had always said, brushing me off with a dismissive, arrogant wave of his manicured hand. "That is exactly what we pay our accounting department for. Let them deal with the boring numbers." But the system had strict rules encoded into its very foundation. My rules. And any major financial decision, any single wire transfer over $10,000, absolutely required my personal, highly encrypted digital authorization. For 7 long years, I had been the quiet, compliant, silent partner. I had sat at this very desk, happily clicking approve on ridiculous luxury vacation packages, designer corporate shopping sprees, and mysterious, highly inflated consulting fees paid out directly to Roxy. All of it had been carefully disguised as legitimate, necessary business expenses to avoid tax issues. I had been an absolute, blind fool for love. But tonight, I was a fool with unrestricted, top-tier administrative access. And the time for silent approval was officially over. I cracked my knuckles, staring at the glowing blue dashboard on my screen. I was about to execute a digital execution. I sat there in the quiet of my home office, bathed only in the blue light of my computer screen. The first kill was going to be the easiest one. I opened the search bar within the company's travel management portal. I typed in my husband's name. There it was, sitting right at the top of the upcoming queue. Monty and Roxanne. They had booked a massive corporate retreat. Their destination was an exclusive, 5-star beachfront resort in St. Bart's, scheduled for the following week. I stared at the screen and I could almost perfectly picture the two of them. I could see them lounging by the infinity pool, sipping expensive imported champagne, and laughing about how incredibly foolish I was. I placed my hand firmly over the computer mouse. It took just a few simple clicks. I generated a single, unique authorization code. And just like that, their tropical victory lap evaporated into thin air. I systematically cancelled the first-class flights. I cancelled the luxury oceanfront suite. I even cancelled the romantic couples spa package that cost more than a reliable used car. Every single bit of it was gone in less than 30 seconds. An automated cancellation email was probably already on its way to Monty's private inbox. Next on my list was the spectacular public humiliation I had just walked away from. I pulled up the primary expense report for the evening. I scrolled through the ridiculous, inflated charges. There was the Grand Meridian ballroom rental. There was the massive catering bill with its ludicrous charges for artisanal imported cheeses and swan-shaped delicate pastries. There were the charges for the celebrity florist and the classical string quartet. All of it had been improperly charged to Luminatech's corporate events accounting division. Monty had likely justified it as a networking opportunity. Stop payment orders are a beautiful, highly effective tool when you know exactly how to file them correctly in the banking system. I drafted a single, cold, automated message. It read, "Payment cancelled due to unauthorized use of corporate funds, pending a full internal financial audit." One by one, I sent that exact message out. I sent it to the luxury venue. I sent it to the upscale caterer. I sent it to the ridiculously expensive professional photographer who had likely captured my precise moment of agony in stunning high definition. They were all about to forcefully discover that my husband's grand, romantic gestures were completely built on a very fragile foundation of lies. His endless credit line had just been permanently severed. But canceling a few parties and vacations was just trimming the dead branches off a rotting tree. The real target, the absolute nuclear option, was sitting right there on my glowing screen. It was glowing with a quiet, digital menace. The main operational account for Luminatech Solutions. It held exactly $412 million. It was the absolute lifeblood of the entire company, managed by a long series of executive overrides. But ultimately, every single one of those overrides required my primary stakeholder authorization. Monty truly thought he was the one in charge. The entire board of directors thought he was the one running the show. Half of the technology industry thought he was the brilliant mind behind the curtain. But being the handsome public face of a large company and actually running the deep infrastructure are two very different things. And the defining difference, my friends, is always measured in who actually controls the money. I had built multiple fail-safes directly into the core system many years ago. I am a cautious, paranoid coder by my very nature. I always plan meticulously for the absolute worst-case scenario. Every major financial decision, every significant cash transfer, required my encrypted digital signature. It used a two-factor authentication process tied directly to a physical security key that I always kept locked inside my wall safe. It was a completely bulletproof system, assuming both executives were operating in good, honest faith. That specific assumption about my husband had been a catastrophic, heartbreaking error in my personal judgment. The total system lockdown took me exactly 30 seconds to implement. A bold, red dialog box popped up on my screen. It was one I had designed myself. It read, "Initiate emergency financial protocol, yes or no?" I firmly clicked yes. A second warning box appeared immediately. It read, "This action will completely freeze all outgoing expenditures and require primary stakeholder authorization for reversal." Confirm. My index finger hovered over the mouse button. This was it. This was the absolute point of no return. I thought of Monty's cruel, mocking words echoing through the ballroom. I thought of Roxanne's triumphant, poisonous smirk. I thought of the awful laughter of the crowd. I clicked the mouse. Confirmed. And just like that, Luminatech Solutions was financially paralyzed. There would be absolutely no wire transfers. There would be no vendor payments. There would be no access to the massive operational funds. The entire corporate machine ground to a violently screeching halt, completely silenced by a single, vengeful click of my finger. My mobile phone, which I had left sitting on the corner of the mahogany desk, started buzzing almost immediately. It did not stop. It lit up the dark room like a deranged warning light, vibrating violently against the polished wood. Monty's name flashed brightly on the screen. Then Roxanne's name appeared. Then our chief financial officer, her name appearing in frantic red letters. Then came random phone numbers I did not immediately recognize, but I could easily guess they belonged to very angry, very confused board members whose financial portfolios were about to take a massive nosedive. I picked up the vibrating phone. I looked closely at the digital chaos rapidly unfolding on its small screen. With a deep sense of profound, absolute calm washing over my body, I powered the device completely off. I woke up as the sun was just beginning to rise over the New York skyline. I had only managed about 3 hours of fitful sleep, but I was feeling more clear-headed and vibrantly alive than I had felt in 7 years. The pale morning light streaming through my large bedroom windows felt distinctly different. It felt cleaner, as if the heavy rain from the night before had washed the city entirely clean of all the previous night's filth and deception. I finally powered my mobile phone back on. It was an absolute digital apocalypse. I had exactly 156 missed calls. There were 283 text messages. I had a small novel's worth of frantic, panicked voicemails. The messages transitioned from deep confusion, to intense anger, to desperate, pathetic pleading. I completely ignored every single one of them and walked directly into the kitchen to make a fresh pot of coffee. I did not make the pretentious, single-origin artisanal nonsense that Monty always insisted we buy. I made real, strong coffee. The good, old-fashioned dark roast that could wake the dead and did not require a fancy culinary degree to correctly describe its flavor profile. The massive kitchen felt wonderfully enormous and blessedly silent. There was no whirring blender making some awful green health smoothie. There were no passive-aggressive sticky notes left on the refrigerator about whose turn it was to buy the ridiculously expensive organic almond milk. It was just me, my steaming hot coffee, and the deeply satisfying, heavy silence of a life that was finally, truly my own again. I was about halfway through my first warm cup when the building intercom buzzed loudly. It was a very jarring, harsh sound in my newfound peace. I pressed the button. It was Patrick, the loyal man who worked the front desk in the lobby. His deep voice was heavily laced with the practiced, careful neutrality of a man who has personally seen every single kind of wealthy people drama imaginable. "Good morning, Mrs. Evans," he said smoothly. "My sincere apologies for the extremely early call. There is a young man standing down here in the lobby. His name is Fletcher. He says he works directly for your husband. He is pretty upset, ma'am." Fletcher. He was Monty's executive assistant. He was a decent, hard-working young kid. Very smart, very ambitious, fresh out of an expensive business school with a massive, crushing mountain of student loans to pay off. He had simply made the terrible mistake of hitching his career wagon to the completely wrong star. I felt a genuine pang of deep sympathy for the boy. He was just innocent collateral damage in a brutal corporate war he did not even know was actively being fought. "Send him up, Patrick." "Thank you," I replied calmly. I had just enough time to tie the belt on my heavy silk robe before Fletcher burst through my heavy front door. He looked absolutely terrible. He looked like a walking hurricane of pure panic mixed with cheap department store cologne. His normally immaculate, gelled hair was a complete mess. His silk tie was violently askew. He was clutching a paper coffee cup with a terrifying, white-knuckled grip as if it were a life-preserver in a stormy ocean. "Mrs. Evans, thank God you are finally here," he babbled uncontrollably. The panicked words were tumbling entirely over each other in a frantic, breathless rush. "There has been some kind of massive technical glitch at the office. A cascading systems failure, I think. All of the bank accounts are completely frozen. The international payroll for our London office is due in exactly 2 hours and the system will not let us process it. The big investor meeting this morning had to be cancelled because the conference room booking did not go through. And Monty's corporate American Express card was violently declined at the coffee shop. It was declined over a $5 coffee, Mrs. Evans. He is completely freaking out right now because Roxanne's card was also declined. Their trip to the Caribbean got officially cancelled. He has been screaming on the phone with the primary bank all morning and they keep saying it is an internal authorization issue. I raised one hand slowly, palm facing outward. I interrupted his frantic monologue. My voice was incredibly calm, providing a stark, jarring contrast to his wild hysteria. Breathe, Fletcher. Just breathe. He sucked in a very shaky, loud lungful of air. His wide, exhausted eyes stared at me with the desperate, clinging hope of someone looking for a magical savior. Can you please fix it? He asked weakly. Monty specifically said it was probably just a minor server issue. Something to do with the complex firewall you originally designed. He told me that since you built all the core systems, you were the absolute only person in the world who could sort this mess out. Did Monty send you here to my home, Fletcher? I asked. My tone remained gentle and measured. Fletcher deflated a little bit. He looked down nervously at his polished leather shoes. Yes, ma'am. He did. He told me he would want to know about these severe technical issues right away to protect the company's assets. Technical issues. That was incredibly rich. My cheating husband still genuinely thought this was just an unfortunate bug in the computer system. He refused to believe it was a deliberate feature working exactly as I had intended it to work. He had spent so many long years posing proudly as the untouchable king that he had completely forgotten who had actually hauled the stones to build his castle and who currently held all the heavy iron keys to the gates. Fletcher, I said, my voice turning just a little bit firmer. Were you present at the corporate party last night? His young face rapidly went through about 6 completely different intense emotions in the short span of 2 seconds. I saw pure confusion, followed by dawning recognition. Then came acute, burning embarrassment. Finally, a sick, completely horrified understanding washed over his features that made me feel genuinely, truly sorry for him. He nodded his head slowly. His gaze remained firmly fixed on the cold marble floor of my entryway. I see, I replied softly. I turned around and walked purposefully over to my mahogany desk. I picked up a thick, heavy manila envelope that I had carefully prepared while he was riding the elevator up to my floor. I walked back and held it out toward him. I need you to take this directly to Monty. Hand it to him personally. Tell him he has exactly 24 hours to respond to what is inside. There will be absolutely no extensions. There will be no negotiations of any kind. Tell him the clock officially started the very moment you walked out through my front door. 24 hours. Fletcher took the thick envelope from my hands as if it were highly radioactive material. What? But what should I tell him about the frozen accounts? What about the international payroll? What about the cancelled meetings? You tell him the absolute truth, I instructed, looking him straight and unblinking in the eye. I desperately wanted this young man to fully understand the massive gravity of the message he was about to carry. You tell him that there are absolutely no technical glitches happening today. Tell him the computer system is working perfectly. It is functioning exactly as it was designed to function. Tell him that sometimes, when you arrogantly decide to burn a bridge down to ashes, you painfully discover you were standing on the completely wrong side of the river all along. He just blinked rapidly at me. The heavy metaphor was clearly flying directly over his caffeine-addled, severely sleep-deprived young head. Mrs. Evans, I really do not understand what is going on here. I let out a long, heavy sigh. He really was a genuinely good kid. He deserved so much better than to be working for a deceptive, manipulative snake like Monty. Fletcher, how exactly long have you worked for Luminatech? I asked. Almost 2 years, ma'am, he answered nervously. And in those 2 long years, how many major business decisions have you personally seen? How many lucrative contracts over $1 million have you seen Monty sign without requiring my final, direct authorization? He thought about the question carefully. His brow furrowed in deep concentration. I could practically see the rusty gears turning inside his head as he finally started connecting the dots. These were dots that had been resting right there in front of his face for 2 entire years. He remembered the countless times Monty would awkwardly stall a meeting by saying, "I need to run this specific clause by Connie first." He remembered the unchangeable fact that my encrypted digital signature was always the final, legally necessary step on every single major acquisition and vendor partnership. I do not think I have ever actually seen him make a major, finalized decision without your final say-so, ma'am, Fletcher finally admitted softly. That is exactly because he cannot, I said simply and clearly. Luminatech Solutions is not his company, Fletcher. It never was his. I founded it entirely by myself. I funded it with my own money. My personal patents are its very lifeblood. Your boss has been a charming spokesperson. He has been a very well-compensated public face. But he has never, not for one single day of his life, been the person truly in charge. I paused and let that heavy reality sink completely into his mind. So, when he deliberately decided to publicly humiliate me last night in front of all our loyal employees and crucial business partners while asking another woman to marry him, well, that was a pretty clear, undeniable signal that our business partnership was officially terminated. I gestured pointedly with the sealed envelope still trembling in his hands. This envelope just makes it legally official. Fletcher's face had gone completely, shockingly pale. What happens now? What happens to the company? To everyone's jobs? What about my salary? That depends entirely on how quickly and how smartly Monty responds to the legally binding terms inside that envelope, I told him calmly. I walked him slowly toward the front door. Just before he stepped out into the hallway, I waited until he finally met my eyes again. I gave him a small, genuinely sad smile. Whatever happens next, I assure you it will not be a technical glitch. And Fletcher? You might really want to start updating your resume today. Just a friendly, professional suggestion. After Fletcher finally left the apartment, the silence inside the penthouse felt incredibly different. It was no longer just a peaceful silence. It was heavily charged with raw, undeniable power. I walked back into my office and sat down at my laptop. I did not log into work. I simply sat there to reflect quietly on the devastating document I had drafted in the early, dark hours of the morning alongside my lawyer, Harrison. Inside that thick envelope was not a polite negotiation. It was a brutal, unconditional surrender document. It was a masterful piece of strategic, corporate warfare cleverly disguised as a standard company restructuring. Harrison had read it over the phone and called it beautifully, brutally effective. It contained exactly 7 points. 7 sharp daggers aimed right at Monty's life. 1. Monty resigns completely as chairman and from all executive positions at Luminatech Solutions, effective immediately upon providing his signature. There would be absolutely no graceful, 6-month transition period. There would be no face-saving press release stating he was stepping down to pursue other exciting opportunities. It would be a clean, swift amputation of his career. 2. Roxanne is permanently, legally banned from any and all business involvement, lucrative consulting arrangements, or contractual relationships with Luminatech or any of its global subsidiaries. Her pathetic little boardroom coup was violently over before it had even truly begun. 3. I, Constance Evans, immediately assumed the full roles of Chief Executive Officer and Financial Oversight Director. I retain unlimited, absolute veto power over any corporate expenditure exceeding $1,000. Every single cup of coffee, every catered lunch, every fraudulent business expense would now require my personal, line item approval before a single penny moved. 4. This was the point that would completely break him. Monty legally agrees to repay the astronomical sum of $412 million directly to the company in structured, heavily monitored installments over a strict period of 5 years. I had spent all night relentlessly doing the difficult math. I ran comprehensive audits on 7 years of his bloated expense reports. I calculated every single penny of corporate funds he had selfishly wasted on their lavish, disgusting lifestyle. Every spa treatment, every designer shopping spree, every first-class flight, every 5-star luxury hotel. All of it was meticulously itemized, printed out, and ready for aggressive collection. He was going to spend the rest of his life working to pay me back. 5. Monty will issue a formal public statement, completely drafted by me, within 72 hours of signing. The statement will publicly acknowledge me as the sole founder, the primary technical architect, and the 90% majority stakeholder of the company. After 7 long years of him proudly taking all the bows and applause for my exhausting work, it was finally time for the world to know the unvarnished truth. 6. All corporate benefits previously extended to him are hereby immediately terminated. He loses access to the private company jet. He loses all unlimited corporate credit cards. He loses his executive assistant. He loses the luxury company car. His entire cushy, protected lifestyle, funded entirely by my complex algorithms, was officially over. And the 7th, final term. This was my absolute personal favorite. A comprehensive, ironclad non-disclosure agreement. For a strict period of 5 full years, he was legally forbidden from writing a tell-all memoir, giving any form of media interview, appearing on any podcast, or making any form of public commentary regarding his former executive role or his personal relationship with the company or myself. 5 entire years of enforced, legally binding silence. The man who had built his entire adult career on charmingly talking about difficult work he did not actually do was about to have absolutely nothing allowed to say. It was incredibly harsh. It was absolutely career-ending. It was, without a single doubt in my mind, the most ruthless, cold-blooded thing I had ever done in my life. But my lawyer confirmed it was all completely, beautifully legal. Monty had exactly 23 hours and counting to sign his entire life away. It was finally time to see if he was any better at doing simple math than he was at being a loyal husband. I fully expected the desperate knock on my door around 10 o'clock that evening. That is usually about the time the 3rd bottle of red wine would have fully kicked into his system. It is the exact hour when false, arrogant bravado dissolves completely into pure, liquid panic. He ultimately waited until 11:30. The loud pounding on my front door was not the polite, measured knock of an expected visitor. It was the frantic, incredibly desperate hammering of a broken man who has just tragically realized his entire world is built entirely out of fragile cards, and a massive hurricane is actively blowing through his living room. I took my absolute sweet time getting up from my chair and walking to the heavy wooden door. I deeply savored the small, petty act of making him stand out in the hallway and wait for me. For 7 long years, he had proudly held all the social power and all the public recognition. He had successfully made me feel like an invisible supporting character in the story of my very own life. Tonight, the tables had finally, violently turned. I was going to deeply enjoy every single second of watching him realize that his reign was over. When I finally pulled the heavy door open, the sight of him standing there was almost pathetic. He looked exactly like he had been repeatedly hit by a speeding train made entirely of brutal consequences. His usually perfectly styled, expensive haircut was a disheveled, sweaty mess. His custom-tailored suit was deeply wrinkled and horribly stained down the front with something that looked suspiciously like spilled red wine. His face, which was usually tanned, glowing, and supremely confident, was completely pale, bloated, and heavily streaked with dried tears. But it was his eyes that told the real, devastating story. The arrogant, self-assured, mocking gleam from last night was entirely gone. It had been replaced by the wild, desperate, terrified look of a cornered animal realizing there is no escape. This was a man who had clearly spent the last 12 exhausting hours desperately calling high-priced lawyers, shady accountants, and absolutely anyone else who would answer his frantic calls, only to be repeatedly told the exact same horrible truth over and over again. He was completely trapped. "Please, Connie," he whispered. His voice was cracked, raw, and broken. "Please. You cannot destroy us like this." Us. The very word felt entirely foreign and completely absurd to hear. "There is absolutely no us anymore, Monty. You and Roxanne made that fact perfectly, publicly clear to the whole world last night." I stepped aside and let him stumble into the apartment. It was a silent, incredibly cold gesture. I actually wanted him to see it all clearly one last time. I wanted him to look at this massive penthouse, this unearned life of obscene luxury, completely purchased with the money I had painstakingly earned. I had earned it by writing flawless code in a dark room while he was out building fake relationships at charity lunches and drinking at five-star hotels. He stumbled clumsily into the large living room and completely collapsed onto the bright white Italian leather sofa he had specifically picked out. "You cannot possibly be serious about these terms," he pleaded, his voice cracking horribly with pure disbelief. $412 million, Connie? That is entirely impossible. It is completely insane. Nobody has that kind of liquid money. I walked calmly over to the bar. I poured myself a small measure of scotch, my second glass of the long night. I walked back and sat down gracefully in the heavy armchair directly across from him, maintaining a very safe, distinct physical distance. "You spent $412 million of my company's money, Monty. The math really is not that complicated to understand. I have all the detailed receipts." "Our money," he corrected me automatically. It was a pathetic, dying echo of his old, sickening entitlement. It was the company's money. It was used strictly for business expenses. It was for networking. It was for aggressively building the brand. Is that exactly what we are legally calling your disgusting affair with my stepsister now? A necessary business expense? Was the massive diamond engagement ring just a minor line item that my auditors completely missed? His pale face crumpled instantly like a discarded piece of cheap paper. The ugly, violent, racking sobs started right then. It was the specific kind of heavy crying that happens when a deeply arrogant man finally, painfully realizes he has made a mistake so monumental, so incredibly catastrophic, that there is absolutely no way to fix it. There is no smooth talking his way out. There is no way to take it back. If you've made it this far, please do me a favor, like the video and comment number 1 down below. It lets me know how awesome you are and shows that you're right here with me on this journey. Your support is a massive encouragement and truly motivates me. Drop that one so I can recognize you, and now, let's get back to my story. It was not supposed to happen like this, Monty stammered weakly between his heavy, wet sobs. Roxanne and we just deeply connected at that technology conference down in Miami. She made me feel truly seen. She made me feel powerful, Connie. She made me feel like I was so much more than just your handsome husband. More than just the guy standing in the background while you did the real work. You were always so much more than just my husband, I said. My voice was dangerously quiet, slicing cleanly through his pathetic wall of self-pity. You were my trusted business partner. You were my co-founder. You were the one person in the world I fully trusted with half of my entire life's hard work. And you completely threw it all away. For what? For a toxic woman who happily orchestrated your marriage proposal as a sick public humiliation stunt aimed directly at me? Real romantic, Monty. Real classy. It was Roxy's idea, he suddenly cried out loudly. The cowardly words were tumbling frantically from his mouth in a desperate rush, as if somehow confessing her sins would miraculously absolve him of his own. The whole entire thing was her plan. She told me it would be fun. She said it was a brilliant way to shake things up, to finally make you realize exactly how much you really needed me around. She swore to me that you would fight for me. She said you would make a massive scene, and it would publicly prove how much you still cared. She planned every single detail of it. I just sat there and stared at him. My face was a cold mask of unyielding stone. So, let me get this perfectly straight. This was all just some kind of sick, twisted psychological test? You purposefully destroyed our 7-year marriage, and you tried to ruin my professional reputation in front of 400 important people, just to see if I would put on a hysterical show for your cheap entertainment? It was not exactly like that. It was exactly like that, Monty. I cut him off sharply. I leaned forward in my chair, my voice dropping down to an icy, terrifying whisper. You and Roxanne deliberately turned my entire life into a cheap piece of performance art. You two thought you were the bright stars, and you thought I was the gullible fool. Except, you completely forgot one tiny, incredibly crucial detail. The quiet fool you were performing for actually owned the entire theater. She owned the massive production company. And she held the legal rights to the entire script. You selfishly tried to erase me using my own money. You used my tireless work to build a massive platform for your own fragile ego. And then you used that very platform to try and publicly execute me. This is not a mistake, Monty. It is a deliberate strategy. And I play strategy infinitely better than anyone you have ever met in your entire life. He looked wildly around the massive room then. His bloodshot eyes darted frantically from the expensive paintings to the sweeping city views, as if he was truly seeing it all for the very last time. Which, of course, he absolutely was. The terms in that envelope are completely unreasonable, he whispered. His voice was small, weak, and utterly defeated. The ridiculous amount of money. The humiliating public statement. The non-disclosure agreement. You are actively trying to destroy my entire future. No, I said, standing up smoothly from my chair. It was a clear physical signal that this exhausting conversation was permanently over. I am not destroying anything at all. I am just legally making sure that, for the very first time in your adult life, your future is based entirely on your own actual work instead of effortlessly stealing mine. A novel concept, I know. He looked up at me then. I saw a last, desperate, pathetic flicker of something cunning returning to his swollen eyes. You recorded the proposal, did you not? I saw your friend standing there with her phone out. That specific video, Connie. If that footage ever gets out to the press, it would completely destroy Roxanne, too. Her conservative investors, her board members, they would absolutely crucify her for the terrible publicity. You could easily use it as leverage. You could forcefully blackmail her into helping me pay the massive financial settlement. I reached into my pocket and slowly pulled out my mobile phone. I had, in fact, asked a trusted friend in the crowd to record the whole awful thing. I quickly found the file sitting in my video gallery. I tapped the screen and played a few seconds of it out loud. The ugly, mocking laughter filled my living room. His cruel, amplified words. Roxanne's triumphant, vicious smile. The whole sordid scene was playing in perfect, high-definition clarity. Then, as he watched me closely, his eyes completely wide with a strange, sick, desperate hope, my right thumb moved deliberately over the glowing screen. I firmly pressed the delete button. A small confirmation window popped up immediately. It read, "Delete this video. This action cannot be undone." I pressed delete. Then, just for absolute good measure, I navigated deep into my cloud backup storage and permanently deleted the file from there as well. "What the hell are you doing?" he gasped loudly. He actually lunged forward on the white couch as if he could somehow physically reach into the digital phone and magically save the deleted file. "That was your only leverage. That was your solid proof." "I do not need cheap leverage," I told him. My voice was completely flat and utterly final as I slipped the phone safely back into my pocket. "I have something significantly better than a viral video. I have the legal ownership papers. I have the technical patent filings. I have the undeniable bank records. I have 7 long years worth of heavy documentation that clearly proves exactly who built this company from the ground up, and who just dressed up in a suit and pretended to run it. Roxanne is just a minor symptom, Monty. She is not the actual disease. She saw a golden opportunity and she greedily took it. But you are the one who deliberately betrayed 7 years of our sacred partnership. You are the one who selfishly spent my money. You are the one who will sign those papers right now. He crumpled then. He truly, completely, and physically crumbled into the sofa. His broad shoulders began shaking violently with the kind of deep, gut-wrenching sobs that can only come from the absolute dark bottom of a person's damaged soul. It came from the exact place where cowards keep their absolute worst mistakes and their heaviest regrets. I will sign, he whispered weakly through his flowing tears. The fight was completely, entirely gone from his body. I will sign your damn papers. But you are destroying me, Connie. You fully know that, right? My entire life is officially over. No, I said, walking briskly to the front door and pulling it wide open for him. I am just making absolutely sure your new life finally reflects your actual, real contributions to our partnership. You have exactly until noon tomorrow to return those signed papers. After that deadline passes, the terms get significantly worse. He pulled himself up from the couch. He walked slowly past me like a hollow ghost. He was nothing but a broken shell of the confident man I had once, inexplicably, truly loved. At the open door, he turned back to look at me one last time. His face was a tragic mess of tears and pure desperation. He was searching my face for any tiny sign of weakness, any microscopic crack in my firm resolve. This isn't you, Connie, he said softly. His voice was a pathetic, dying plea. This incredibly cold, calculated revenge, it is just not who you really are. You are absolutely right, I told him quietly, my hand resting steady on the cold brass doorknob. It isn't who I was. And I closed the heavy door firmly right in his face. The very next morning, I specifically dressed for a corporate war. I put on a stunning, navy blue Tom Ford power suit that cost a small fortune, but it made me feel exactly like I was wearing impenetrable armor. I wore a pair of Italian leather heels that were stylish, but sensible enough for me to stand my ground firmly in. And, as a final touch, I put on the diamond earrings Monty had bought me for our 5th anniversary. It was a final, completely silent gesture of absolute dominance. Before heading down to the office building, I had a brief, 10-minute phone call with my lawyer, Harrison. He is a legal shark who had been my trusted counsel for many years. Everything is firmly in place, Connie, Harrison said. His voice was a low, confident growl over the phone. The signed documents are completely ironclad. He has absolutely no legal wiggle room left. It is entirely over. His professional confirmation was a soothing balm to my slightly frayed nerves. When I arrived at the Luminatech building, the massive glass-walled boardroom on the 43rd floor felt exactly like a glass fish tank full of very nervous, very expensive fish. The 12 elite board members, men and women I had known and worked alongside for years, sat quietly around a massive obsidian conference table. Each one of them was studiously avoiding making direct eye contact with anyone else in the room. Our chief financial officer was shuffling thick stacks of financial papers with a frantic, terrified energy. Her expensive ballpoint pen was clicking loudly, sounding exactly like a harsh metronome counting down to a public execution. Monty sat all the way at the far end of the long table, positioned as physically far away from my designated seat as the room's geometry would possibly allow. He looked incredibly pale. His eyes were deeply hollow. He looked like he had painfully aged 10 full years in the past 48 hours. Sitting squarely in the center of the leather placemat right in front of him was the thick manila envelope. It was signed. He had beaten my strict noon deadline by exactly 17 minutes. It was a final, pathetic act of total compliance. I walked slowly and deliberately to my rightful seat at the absolute head of the table. The soft, authoritative click of my heels on the marble floor was the only sound echoing in the tense, suffocating silence of the room. I sat down gracefully. I placed my own identical copy of the signed legal agreement squarely on the table. I calmly surveyed the frightened faces around the room. "Good morning," I said loudly. My voice was completely clear and steady, betraying absolutely none of the emotional turmoil of the past 2 incredibly long days. "Thank you all for being here today on such incredibly short notice. As of this exact morning, there have been some very significant changes to Luminatech's core executive structure." I let those heavy words hang in the cold air for a brief moment. I genuinely enjoyed watching the sudden flicker of deep fear and confusion flash in their eyes. Effective immediately, Monty has formally resigned from his position as chairman and chief executive officer. The silence that followed was deafening. You could have easily heard a company stock price drop. The CFO's pen stopped clicking mid-click, frozen awkwardly in the air. Arthur, our oldest sitting board member, a kind man who had actually been a technical mentor to me in the very early days, looked like he was about to have a massive heart attack right in his chair. Additionally, I continued, my voice turning as cold and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, I will be officially assuming the permanent role of Chief Executive Officer. I will also be taking on the newly created position of Financial Oversight Director. I now hold comprehensive, undeniable veto authority over any and all corporate expenditures. I paused and looked directly at the empty leather chair that usually belonged to my stepsister. Furthermore, as of this morning, Roxanne has been officially terminated from her new position. She is permanently, legally banned from any and all involvement with this company or any of its global subsidiaries. Monty looked exactly like he desperately wanted to disappear entirely into the heavy fabric of his chair. He looked like he wanted to magically tunnel straight down through the concrete floor and emerge somewhere completely unnoticed in a different state. But he had one final, humiliating part to play in this awful tragedy that he had actively co-authored. He stood up very slowly. He was clutching a single, crumpled piece of white paper in his trembling hands. This was part of our legal agreement. The public confession, he stammered weakly. I really need to make a brief statement, he began. His voice was cracking terribly. He absolutely refused to look directly at me. Instead, he stared blankly at the far wall, focusing his gaze at a random spot just slightly above Arthur's white head. I want to publicly acknowledge, he read aloud. His voice was a flat, dead monotone. That Constance Evans is the true founder, the primary technical architect, and the 90% majority stakeholder of Luminatech Solutions. She personally developed all of our core algorithms. She personally filed all 23 of our foundational patents. And she made every single strategic technical decision that built this company into what it is today. The distinguished board members were now rapidly looking back and forth between the two of us. Their faces were a complex mixture of absolute shock and a slow, dawning comprehension. This was not just a simple corporate resignation. This was a complete and total abdication. It was a massive corporate confession of the absolute highest order. I was merely the public face of the company, Monty continued painfully. Every single word seemed to cost him something vital and essential from his soul. But Constance was always the actual, true leader. The entire business model that generates all of our revenue, all of that brilliance came exclusively from her intense work, her unique vision, and her personal funding. He took a very shaky, shallow breath. I take full, complete responsibility for grossly misrepresenting my actual role in this company's massive success. And I sincerely apologize to the entire board, to all our investors, and deeply to Constance for any confusion my selfish actions may have caused. He sat back down abruptly. The humiliating performance was finally over. The room instantly fell back into that incredibly thick, heavy, awkward silence. I stood up slowly and walked over to the large, clean whiteboard mounted at the front of the room. I genuinely did not need to do this next part. The legal papers were already fully signed and binding. But these people desperately needed to see it visually to truly understand the massive scale of the corporate fraud they had blindly been party to. I picked up a thick black marker and I wrote 4 simple, devastating lines on the board. Revenue heavily generated by the Evans patents over 7 years, $847 million. Corporate luxury expenses authorized and wasted by Monty over 7 years, $412 million. Key business decisions made solely by Monty, 0. Lines of actual code written by Monty, 0. These numbers, I stated loudly, turning back around to face a room full of highly educated people who were finally understanding the plain truth they had somehow overlooked for years. These numbers are the true foundation and the stark reality of this entire company. Monty has been an excellent, charming spokesperson. But he has never been the leader. As of right now, I am officially lifting the emergency financial freeze on our accounts. All legitimate, approved business operations will resume immediately. All frivolous, unapproved expenditures will be permanently terminated pending a full, aggressive audit. Are there any questions? There were absolutely none. The corporate coup was totally complete. My victory in that room was absolute. But as I stood there quietly, looking out at the beautiful city from my new, rightful position at the very head of the table, it did not actually feel like a joyful victory. It just felt profoundly, heavily necessary. 6 months later, my life was a completely different world. It was an entirely different universe, really. The very first thing I did after finalizing the legal divorce was sell that massive penthouse. All that cold, echoing marble and pristine glass felt exactly like a sad mausoleum dedicated to a fake life I no longer wanted, and a naive woman I no longer was. I packed up my books and moved into a much smaller, warmer apartment located on the quiet Upper West Side. It had a lovely, cozy brick fireplace. It had overflowing wooden bookshelves, and beautiful old windows that actually opened wide to let in the fresh, crisp autumn air. My new neighbors were history professors, retired artists, and busy doctors. They were real people who worked real jobs for honest paychecks. Absolutely no one in my building cared that I had built a multi-million-dollar technology company. They only cared that I politely held the elevator doors open for them and that I did not play my television too loud after 10 o'clock at night. It was wonderfully, blessedly normal. Shortly after the dramatic story of the corporate takeover broke in the news, Forbes magazine ran a massive feature article on me. They officially called me the silent genius behind Luminateca's incredible success. That specific article led directly to an unexpected, wonderful offer from Columbia University. They asked me to be a special guest lecturer at their prestigious business school. 3 days a week, I now stand confidently in front of a classroom full of incredibly bright, hungry graduate students. They are students who actually want to genuinely learn about complex architecture, not just lazily network their way to quick startup funding. It finally felt like I was contributing to something deeply meaningful again, instead of just blindly generating revenue for someone else's luxury lifestyle expenses. I also started investing my money again, but very differently this time. I personally created a small, focused venture capital fund specifically designed for ambitious startups founded exclusively by women in the tech industry. That is exactly how I met a brilliant young woman named Tabitha. She was a fiery 26-year-old with an advanced degree from a top university who had developed a truly revolutionary new form of artificial intelligence. Her business pitch was slightly unpolished and raw, but her core technology was absolutely groundbreaking, and her passion was deeply infectious. The old, conservative board of directors would have never even considered funding her. I wrote her a massive check for $20 million on the absolute spot. It was easily the best, most satisfying business decision I have ever made in my life. We were no longer just building a profitable company. We were actively building an entirely new legacy. A plain white letter arrived in my mailbox on a very rainy Tuesday afternoon in October. The envelope was cheap and unmarked. The handwriting was completely unfamiliar to me at first glance. It was from Monty. He wrote that he had been forced to move back to his small hometown in Ohio. It was a depressing place he had always proudly sworn to me he would never, ever return to. He was currently working at a tiny, underfunded local community college, managing their small IT department. It was a very basic job with a remarkably modest salary and absolutely no corporate perks whatsoever. He wrote that Roxanne had completely abandoned him the exact same day the divorce was finalized and his access to the very last of his hidden funds was legally cut off by my lawyers. She callously told him that he was no longer a growth asset. He said he was now taking basic computer classes at night, painfully trying to learn how to write code from scratch. He said he was finally, brutally learning the massive difference between simply being important and actually being useful. "You tried patiently to teach me that lesson for years," he wrote. The very last line of his letter read, "I am so incredibly sorry it took losing absolutely everything for me to finally understand what you meant." I read the letter twice. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger. No joy. No lingering sadness. I folded the paper carefully and placed it gently into a small, carved wooden box where I keep old things from my past. They are things that are not completely forgotten, but they are entirely finished. The corporate war was officially over. And to my own immense surprise, the beautiful, quiet peace that followed felt infinitely, profoundly better than the initial thrill of revenge ever could. My life was completely my own now. Every single part of it was measured not in fluctuating stock prices or massive square footage, but in genuine, earned accomplishments and quiet, everyday joys. Sometimes, the greatest victories do not need a massive audience. Some wins are worth so much more than thunderous applause from people who do not truly care about you. They are quiet. They are deeply personal. And they are, finally, completely peaceful. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my story today. It was not entirely easy to open up and share all of that painful history, but I truly felt it was important to talk about. If you have ever been through a terrible betrayal, big or small, or if you have ever felt like your massive contributions were totally invisible to the people you love, please know that you are absolutely not alone. Your inner strength is always so much greater than your temporary pain. I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts on my journey, so please feel free to share your own stories or opinions in the comments section below. And if my story resonated with you in any way, a simple like and a subscribe to the channel would mean the absolute world to me. It lets me know that we are slowly building a real, supportive community right here. Please take good care of yourselves and take care of each other. I will talk to you all again very soon.